We gather at a juncture of unparalleled consequence, a crossroads where the unbridled expansion of radio frequency technologies, the systematic suppression of vital health data, and the burgeoning autism crisis converge in a way that tests both our moral fortitude and our intellectual honesty. The stakes could not be higher. Unless we address the unconstitutional legal scaffolding that has underpinned decades of industry-driven obfuscation, no advancement in scientific research, no philanthropic campaign, and no policy refinement will suffice to arrest the devastation currently unfolding in public health, and particularly in the neurodevelopment of our children. At the center of this crisis lie two critical legislative failures. Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This statute has effectively barred local governments from challenging wireless infrastructure on health grounds, supplanting constitutional rights and muzzling public discourse. The systematic defunding and non-enforcement of Public Law 90-602, the Radiation Control for Health and Safety Act of 1968. Despite mandating continuous evaluation of all radiation-emitting devices, this law has been rendered powerless through budgetary strangulation and political disinterest. The consequence of these legislative betrayals is that we, as a society, have been legally blindfolded, prohibited from acknowledging the inescapable link between chronic RF exposure and escalating rates of neurological, immunological, and reproductive disorders. It is impossible to remedy what we are forbidden by law, even to discuss in official capacities. RF radiation as the omnipresent bioelectric disruptor. Modern biology has moved beyond mere biochemical paradigms. It recognizes that the human organism is governed by precisely tuned electromagnetic signals, critical for everything from cellular communication to neurodevelopmental processes. Chronic RF exposure saturates these innate bioelectric networks with incoherent external electromagnetic noise, a relentless form of entropic waste that sabotages the body's capacity to maintain homeostasis. Subthermal bioelectric chaos. While the 19th century thermal model insists that only tissue heating exposures matter, contemporary research reveals that non-thermal electromagnetic interference disrupts calcium ion channels, promotes oxidative stress, and derails DNA repair mechanisms. This is the hidden war on cellular coherence, a war waged at power densities that do not heat tissue, yet still wreak havoc on intracellular communication. Developmental vulnerability. Nowhere is this disruption more devastating than in the developing brain. Neurogenesis, synaptic pruning, and the establishment of stable neural networks rely on clear bioelectric signals. When children, and even fetuses in utero, are bathed in omnipresent RF fields, the very blueprint of their neurological architecture is scrambled. The result is a generation confronted with unprecedented rates of autism spectrum disorders, sensory integration deficits, and a host of neurobehavioral anomalies. Amplification of other stressors. Vaccines, chemical toxins, and dietary exposures indeed pose significant biological challenges. Yet in a system already destabilized by continuous RF interference, where cells cannot reset to their genetically encoded baselines, these additional insults can become permanent developmental derailments. Autistic traits observed after certain medical interventions, for instance, can represent the cumulative failure of a bioelectrically compromised system to return to homeostasis, rather than a simple one-to-one cause and effect relationship. The legislative coup, how Section 704 locks us into ignorance. In 1996, the Telecommunications Act enshrined Section 704, a draconian clause that explicitly forbids local authorities from objecting to wireless installations on the basis of health. This single statutory maneuver eviscerates constitutional protections. By precluding health concerns from regulatory discussions, it effectively nullifies First Amendment rights to petition for redress and the 10th Amendment's protection of local governance autonomy. freezes public discourse. Health-based arguments are rendered inadmissible in public forums, guaranteeing the unchecked proliferation of cell towers, Wi-Fi networks, and other RF-emitting infrastructure, destroys regulatory incentives. Even the most alarming scientific data cannot inform policy if policymakers are legally barred from considering it. Hence, no matter what new evidence arises about RF's toxicological or neurodevelopmental impacts, local communities remain powerless to implement safeguards. Thus, Section 704 is not merely a piece of outdated legislation. It is a carefully engineered structural gag order, designed to perpetuate maximum wireless deployment while insulating the industry from liability. The Dormant Safeguard Public Law 90-602. Contrasting sharply with Section 704's suppression is the long-standing yet neglected Public Law 90-602, the Radiation Control for Health and Safety Act of 1968. If enforced, it would mandate ongoing research. Proper funding of independent investigations would shed light on the real non-thermal dangers of chronic RF exposure, fulfilling the law's original intent. It would guarantee transparency. Findings, both favorable and unfavorable to industry, would be made public, ensuring that policymakers operate on comprehensive, evidence-based analyses. It would also allow adaptive regulation. As new scientific data emerges, exposure guidelines could be recalibrated to reflect accurate biological thresholds. This is the scientific process in action, unhindered by political or industry pressures. The strategic defunding of this law has neutralized a critical check on RF proliferation. Consequently, we have arrived at a dangerous juncture where telecom expansion marches forward in a research vacuum, facilitated by a law, Section 704, that systematically prohibits communities from contesting it. The Autism Advocacy Paradox. Organizations and celebrities championing autism awareness have poured immense resources into researching genetic markers, exploring alternative therapies, and raising public empathy. Yet they have largely ignored or outright avoided challenging the single most pervasive environmental factor implicated in modern neurodevelopmental disruption: ubiquitous RF exposure. Advocacy that sidesteps RF's bioelectric assault only addresses half the equation, if that. We cannot separate the immune system's reaction to vaccinations, heavy metals, or other toxic agents from the baseline chaos introduced by persistent electromagnetic interference. By focusing almost exclusively on social services and behavioral therapies, the autism movement inadvertently upholds the legal structures, Section 704, that perpetuate the expansion of RF infrastructure. Ironically, these same advocates may be unwittingly ensuring that the very epidemic they aim to combat persists indefinitely. Moral and scientific responsibility. It is untenable to champion autism research while ignoring the legislative muzzle that prevents robust examination of RF autism correlations. True advocacy demands a vocal campaign to dismantle Section 704, so that communities can finally assess, challenge, and limit the RF burdens fueling developmental derailments. The Unified Call to Action #Trump Repeal 704 and enforce Public Law 90-602. Repeal Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act. Restoring constitutional rights to challenge infrastructure on health grounds is the indispensable first step. Without local autonomy, no scientific breakthrough, no parental testimony, and no epidemiological study can manifest as actual policy reform. Fully enforce Public Law 90-602, end the systematic defunding, mandate independent research, demand total transparency, resurrect this dormant legislation to impose rigorous, science-based oversight on the wireless industry, cease clinging to the 19th century thermal model, develop new biologically informed exposure guidelines that reflect non-thermal mechanisms, nuanced dose-response curves, and real-world usage scenarios, pulsed intermittent exposures, empower communities, support Li-Fi, fiber optic technologies, and other safer communication alternatives that reduce ambient RF levels, especially crucial in schools, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods. Reform advocacy. Influencers, celebrities, policymakers, and philanthropic organizations dedicated to autism must align their campaigns with the indisputable reality of RF's role in neurodevelopmental disruption. Advocacy must encompass a legislative dimension, demanding #Trump repeal 704 and enforcement of Public Law 90/602. A final plea to the vanguard of thought. Either we confront this orchestrated denial head-on, or we resign ourselves to an escalating crisis, one in which autism rates spiral upward, fertility nosedives, and neurological disorders become the grim hallmark of future generations. The data, the biology, and the constitutional imperatives all converge on the same inescapable conclusion. The status quo is an engineered fraud on public health. We cannot mitigate this crisis without dismantling the legislative roadblocks. We cannot pretend to champion autism solutions while turning a blind eye to the root cause. This is the epochal moment in which our collective moral spine is tested. May history remember us as those who rose above corporate and legislative constraints, who demanded the repeal of Section 704, the enforcement of Public Law 90/602, and who bravely acknowledged the bioelectric truth that stands before us. For in the end, our silence is complicity, our inaction is compliance, and our willingness to accept business as usual is the gateway to irreversible public health calamity. The path forward is clear. #Trump repeal 704. Enforce Public Law 90/602. Reclaim our right to protect the bioelectric sanctity of human life. Visit RF Safe to learn more.